So I'm delighted to be here. I'm happy to take questions. If I say something in the middle that you'd really love clarification on, give me the wave. I did something today that my mother does, and I tease her about. Now I did. So these are my prescription sunglasses. I can't actually see any of you particularly well. My mom does this all the time, and I tease her, and now I have done it. So if you really want to get my attention, which I'm delighted by, probably wave really large. To give you a thumbnail on Draper Richards as a sort of context, and then I can talk more about the international grant making we do. Draper Richards was founded about 10 years ago by two venture capitalists, Bill Draper and Robin Richards. They had been contemporaries in venture for about 10 years and had done something that at the time was quite distinct. Starting in 1994, they did an India fund focused on technology, and there was very little international venture happening at the time. And it was a fund that did quite well. And when they got to the end of that juncture point, Bill wanted to continue to do venture, and Robin had other personal things she wanted to focus on. And so they decided to start a foundation so that they had a way to work together. So the foundation is in no way funded by the venture firm, but is their money that they earned in the venture firm, and it's sort of a labor of love. And they had a theory around venture capital and philanthropy, which I think is one that all of you embrace quite a lot, which is that a substantial diligence process and a strong stewardship of a grant, not because you at all know more about the domain of work a person's doing, but because over time you have the chance to see a life stage repeat over and over. And so you have a sense of how capacity could be built at that time, that could be a helpful steward of a grant. And so that's the kind of grant making we do. We get, I don't know, probably close to 500 applications a year. We fund 4 to 6, and we've actually been raising money so we can fund more like 7 to 9 grants. So it'll still be competitive, but slightly less competitive. Our diligence process usually takes 6 to 10 months. It's usually longer for international candidates, mostly because the logistics of doing the diligence take a lot longer. And during that time, we get from people a fairly extensive budget, an operating plan, but we also do a lot of legwork. Like, we wouldn't make a grant unless we called at least 6 to 10 people in the field in which a person worked to talk to them about their work. Plus, we take call lists from that individual that they feel are people represented in their field who can talk about their work. Sometimes there's overlap on those lists, and that's actually good. Sometimes there's no overlap on those lists, and that's good in a different way. We do fund 501c3s. So I very much resonated with the idea that you all had, that you funded a social entrepreneur, but you wanted them to be local. So for us, local is a more broad concept. You have to have a 501c3 because we want you to govern in the U.S. because part of our grant, we give you $300,000. We sit on your grant, you sit on your board for 3 years, and then we bring you to an annual convening. And our experience has been, and we have tried this, that either sitting on the governing board in another country, so there's a whole different set of governance expectations, is very hard to do. And if your conviction is that you have gotten good at something enough to provide stewardship and support, that all leaves the window when you're in a different governance structure. Plus, the other thing we've appreciated is there's different pieces of the model that have built in over time. And I sense you have a piece of this that you do as well. So yes, we sit on your boards, we bring you to the retreat, but I'd say most grantees I probably talk to every few weeks on the phone, much like my guess is that will happen with Karen and Chuck. And what we found is whether it's, hey, I need an auditor, where's that auditor list you keep? The really sort of banal tactical things, to the, because someone called today and said, I have a staff person that wants to trade healthcare for salary. Can I do that? And we get a lot of those kinds of questions. And so it's helpful to really have that relationship that's proactive enough to engage in that kind of work with people. And we found that if you're in a time zone many, many, many hours away, it's very hard to do that proactively. And so we've learned that though what we fund is somewhat more narrow than maybe some people will come and say they wish we funded, we found that we're at least pretty good at the thing that we've chosen to do. We're agnostic as to the topic and geography and dissemination model in which we fund, which have all been journeys of understanding. So it was always easy to tell people we were agnostic in the geography and the topic arena. But the dissemination model is something we've learned over time. Because admittedly, in the early years of the foundation, Room to Read, Upwardly Global, Taproot, Larrabur Heritage Foundation, Girls for Change, they might be organizations you know. These were organizations that worked in a geography, and over time they moved to multiple geographies. And that for us was dissemination. That kind of dissemination has incredibly high quality results often. And it also means you can often fundraise in the places where you move to over time because there's a group of people who are quite invested in that work being successful. It's also highly staff intensive, which means it's expensive. And it's hard to manage quality because by definition, when you're in a new location, that place has different variables. So over time, dissemination for us can mean different things. It can mean that an organization affiliates with others in a different place who know the location better, and they tinker more with what a turnkey solution means. We funded some advocacy models, which is a more challenging model, quite honestly. What is success in an advocacy model? I do not purport to know the answer to this. I will say we've made grants and we feel like some of them have been successful, but it's much harder to compare those grants to one another. And we've also done some funding of models that by definition have very disparate long legs to them that have nothing to do with the locations they're in. And actually that's sort of the next wave of what it means to do multiple dissemination models. We're trying to sort of unpack how much an organization can say that they can take ownership for change when there's clearly so many other variables on the landscape over time. So admittedly, we're a work in process. We really are trying to learn, and we often learn a lot with our grantees. So I'm thinking I should sort of delve into some of the international grants we've done and maybe give a sort of storytelling of how we felt we were able to be helpful and places where we left people to their own devices. Would that be useful?
Yes, and also anything that didn't work out the way you expected. So
Yes.
I asked Anne Marie, last year we had someone come and they talked a lot about how they made the grant decisions. So that is not so much what Anne Marie's going to talk about, though she could, but it's more about the life cycle of the grant and what happens over the course of time.
Yes, and often I will say, I use Living Goods as an example of this, but I won't in this instance because I feel like that would be redundant. But ironically, we funded Chuck. Chuck is one of the first people ever that we funded off a business plan. We do it very rarely. We usually fund off a small canon of work, whether it's a pilot project or a demonstration project. But we funded Chuck 3 years ago off of a business plan because the combination of his for-profit experience and nonprofit experience was so deep that we felt his life was his proof of concept. And we found his work very exciting. And admittedly, because we understood his fund development strategy was going to be very much about finding larger chunks of money, we wanted to be able to be helpful early, and we felt the way to do that was to provide that significant vote of confidence early. So that's our Chuck story. But I figured I would tell a story of something that went well, and then highlight a couple things that haven't gone well, and then go back to something that went well. Just so you kind of think overall that we do things moderately well. So I was thinking a story to tell is of a man named Andrew Yoon. 1 Acre Fund is the name of the organization. Andrew was a Kellogg student when we first met him. He came to me, I was at a Net Impact conference, which is an organization of MBAs that gather somewhere around the world each year, and they believe in social change. It's a pretty wide tent organization. And Andrew came to me and said, I just wanted to introduce myself because I'm thinking I might change the face of world hunger, and I thought you would want to know more about my work. And Andrew, what I always say to people at conferences, which is, that is so wonderful. Here's my card. You should email me. And interestingly, Andrew emailed me every month until he got a grant from us, which is actually the right way to get a grant often, that sort of sense of stewardship. But Andrew had spent his summer with the Gates Foundation between years of his MBA, studying reams of malaria data in East Africa. And his realization after all that time was that people were sick because they were hungry, which I guess is actually a very simple observation, but not one actually that a lot of big funders fund around. So maybe not everybody's gotten that message in the same way that Andrew did. So he decided to spend his second year of business school exploring what that meant. And what he came away with after a semester was that there's not a very strong integrated input chain for people who are farmers in Africa. So a nonprofit will come through and they'll give you a lot of great seed. But seed isn't so good if you don't have fertilizer, and it's not so good if you don't have water. And honestly, if the person doesn't give you extension agriculture support to know how to use the seed, in the end, it's seed that basically sits fallow in the ground. So Andrew's innovation was, if I can bring people seed, fertilizer, water, and training at the same time, I can actually give them a much better chance of having a substantial growing season. And equally importantly, if they actually grow enough crop that they can eat not all of the crop, and I can give them access to a market, I can actually bring them into the formal economy by giving them cash, which many of these families had never had. Most of them were not eating for several months of the year. So that's the story of 1 Acre Fund at the beginning. He had a couple Kellogg alum that believed in him who gave him about $30,000. He went and found 30 families that were willing to be in his program. I honestly think because they were so hungry that they didn't think their lives could possibly be any worse than they already were, which was very, very terrible. And most of those families tripled and quadrupled their farm output that year. So it was substantial change for them. So when we met him, he was serving 100 families on his second growing cycle. And where he works, which is in Kenya and now in Rwanda, has 2 growing cycles a year. So what's nice about that, one of the things we've observed over time, and this is stepping back a little, is we do better, I put that in quotes, funding models that have a faster rather than a slower evolution cycle. So if we're going to be with you for 3 years, it's hard for us to fund a charter school because by definition, you need that model to live in the community and not harm the people in the community, and it takes iterative cycles to see what success constitutes and what levers you would move to change that success trajectory. So it was one of the nice things about Andrew's model was it actually moved twice a year, which was interesting and different than a U.S.-based growth cycle. But to fast forward, we met him when he was serving 100 families. And to fast forward a lot, because then I'm mostly going to talk about governance in the middle. Today he's serving, and this is only 4 years later, 25,000 families in rural Kenya and Rwanda. And if you look at the labor model that he works with, at any given time, he's training literally at this point probably hundreds of people to potentially be extension agriculture experts for him. And then they move up a ladder chain. So it's one of the, in some of the regions where he works, it's one of the only hierarchical labor models that exists in those places. And even people who don't get hired by One Acre Fund often report that they go home and their farms are much more successful. So there's this sort of interesting value that he provides even just by seeding the knowledge that he has in the communities where he works. But to focus on the governance piece, because I feel like that's where we've had an impact, because honestly, except for what I've just told you now, that's everything I know about extension agriculture in Africa. You now know everything I do. I know nothing about planting cycles. I know nothing about how far apart to put seed. I don't know how much fertilizer you should use when compared to seed, and Andrew knows those things and I don't. But when Andrew came to us, his board was 12 people he got his MBA with. Nice people, most of whom had never been to Africa, most of them had actually never been to a developing country, but they really wanted to be helpful. So one of the things that I had said to Andrew when we were sort of at the early stages of the grant was, I think during the life of this grant, one of the things we're going to do is we're going to focus on evolving your board. So that was one piece we talked about. Andrew, when he came to us, his funding came from 2 places. It came from generous Kellogg alum, who were more substantial givers in terms of where their own careers had taken them. And more than half of his business school class had pledged to him $250 a year for his work, which we also found incredibly interesting. The last time I saw more than half those people, and this is 4 or 5 years later, still give at least $250 a year to his work, and some more, and some no more. But that was really interesting to us, that sort of really strong sense of momentum he had. But we agreed he needed a fund development plan because Andrew still chooses to live in Africa for 9 to 10 months of the year. So he needs a fund development plan because he's in the U.S. He needs to take on activities that fairly rapidly allow him to raise money so he can go back into his location. And the reason he makes this choice, because if you over time continue to look at international and look for people who are in situ versus not, his strong belief, and I have to say I had to come to this place of understanding this, and now I believe it very strongly. And Chuck accomplishes this in a different way, but I think he would say something similar. Andrew believes really strongly that in the end, for this model to work, if you're going to touch tens and hundreds of thousands of farm families live, the model needs to be awesome. It needs to be ironclad in its operational capacity. So he recognizes that half of his capacity is bringing in money. He's credible, he's gifted, he's authentic. But more than half of his value in the end comes down to his standing in a field and understanding where the value chain is or isn't working, or standing in a seed repository and having some insight about that. And that's why he continues to live in this incredibly rural place in Kenya called Bungoma, which is 100 miles west of Eldoret, if that's useful to anyone. That's the closest airport. So we decided fund development plan would be the second thing we would focus on. And the third thing we agreed that was worth focusing on was culture building, with the strong observation that we weren't actually sure where people would sit within the culture, but we had a sense that having a sense of culture would be important for the organization. So when Draper Richards makes milestones with folks, and they're from what I can tell, I remember filling out a survey for Chuck, which went through a variety of different Well, that's very joyful, I think. I think so.
Maybe Bob was
But I feel like this is a way for him to really distinguish himself as a Chicago member.
Jazz.
It's working for me. Um, but, so clearly you're looking at the health of the whole organization, and we do something similar. So when we have milestones, there's a section on program. We'd like to think your program will exist and grow, but a lot of the milestones we build with people are around organizational capacity, staff, board, financial systems. We'd actually like to see that you have a financial system by the end of the grant. And mind you, these are folks, when we fund people, the average size organization we fund is 150K in budget. So they tend to be actually pretty modest. So for some people, the thought of like leaving their spreadsheet and porting it into any system is a very, very scary process. We actually expect people to have a CRM system by the time they leave us. And again, that process of sort of saying, you know, I want to commit to Salesforce or I want to commit to whatever that system is, but actually making it happen. These are really hard things, especially if you have a staff of 2 or 3. And you know probably this from the grants you've made, finding the staff capacity for that is very challenging. So we try to put a lot of those things into the milestones because then we would never hold back a grant for that, but I think it leaves space for a conversation, and those conversations I think can be really fruitful. Having an audit, having board assessment, making sure that all staff within the first 2 years of the organization get a review, making sure the ED gets a review. A lot of those things are actually in the milestones too. But those are the things we put into Andrew's milestones. So just to sort of highlight what those looked like, because, and actually I want to stop and ask a question, because I realize actually that this could be the trajectory for any grant in our portfolio. It happens to be international one. So is it better to step back and do more international, or is it helpful to talk about this sort of governance evolution piece?
We'd love to hear about your international focus.
All right.
How do you make
No, that's helpful then. So let me then step back and do another story like that. And so that's the encapsulation then. We work in board development, culture, and fund development plans, which if that's really interesting to someone, I can email you or talk to you about later. Another grantee that comes to mind, which, and this was actually a grant which I felt like on many levels was a tremendous, abysmal failure. This was an organization that was working with schools in southern Sudan. And it was using a model of schools which is somewhat known, which is putting a farm in the middle of the school. So this idea that if you can create a sustainable revenue stream, you can build a school around it. And also in places where there aren't a lot of sustainable food sources that by definition the kids at the school actually have a chance to eat, whether they're boarding schools or kids come from some distance, close or near, to go to school. And we looked at the grant about a year before, and we passed on it in great measure at the time because southern Sudan was so unstable that people we talked to about southern Sudan said it wasn't safe actually for people to do work there. So their ability to hire people and to build systems would be greatly impeded. So we passed on the grant at the time. And I have to say what stayed in my mind about that grant was southern Sudan is not safe. So a lot of the other things I learned in my diligence process I didn't entirely mentally own. So this is, of course, the crux of the challenge. When southern Sudan became safer, I thought to myself, we should go back and relook at that loan. So, of course, I neglected to remember other things I'd learned in my diligence the first time. Like that even though southern Sudan was in some ways safer, there were certain tribal groups that continued to have great disagreements with one another. And yes, it was maybe moderately safe, but only in the context of working with groups of people who wanted to work together. And that actually ended up being one of the reasons that the wheels fell off the cart on this grant, was there ended up being a big insurgency between two rivaling groups, tribal groups of people on the campus of the school. So that was actually really terrible because it put at risk people who had nothing to do with either of those tribal groups of people. There were other pieces that I think were really tricky. We focused a lot on the school. We focused a lot on its curriculum, where they were going to find girls, how they were going to staff the school. We focused less on the farm. In hindsight, I think, and it's always easy to think in hindsight, I probably should have focused more of my diligence on the farm because that was actually the revenue generating agent for the school. Because what was interesting was the school did quite well. The school was serving several hundred girls. They had found very capable teachers who'd sort of literally come out of the woodwork, meaning they'd been people who'd been there in hiding in some way, who came and taught at the school. And US-based donors had a lot of appetite for the girls. They were sponsoring students, they were sending supplies. The school did really well. But not only did the farm not do well, but the farm, because it didn't do well, was a huge drain on the resources of the school. And because it both now existed and it was almost a sunk cost, and because there was a sense in the future it would be such a more useful vehicle than it was, it became just like a sponge for resources. And so what was interesting was that challenge was probably in the end what should have killed the grant, would have eventually killed the grant, because this is a grant we didn't see through to completion. But because of the violence related to the tribal warfare, that was what unsummarily and quickly killed the grant. But I'd have to say this was one of those experiences where, as a person on the board, there's a ton of upside on getting to sit on people's boards. You experience a lot of joyful moments. You get to be with them when they make hard and interesting decisions. But the tribal warfare piece of this actually played out on the board as well. The board was in Vermont, and it was made up of people from 2 different tribes and people that were from the U.S. who happened to all be white. And so I remember flying to Vermont on 3 separate occasions to attend board meetings. And I was sort of like, there was sort of fish, fowl, and then that woman from San Francisco. That was sort of how it felt. And in itself, it was very, very challenging to feel like I was mediating with a group of people that I had very little cultural context with. Like, it was almost like, where does your cultural competence begin and end? And it was so obvious where my cultural competence ended. I mean, I was so out of my league on so many levels. And then when there was the violence on the campus, thinking, this is well beyond what we have D&O insurance for, I'm certain. So I guess I mentioned that because it was such a learning for me. Like, I would go home at night and I just felt such a strong sense of responsibility for things that were so out of my control and so far away. And I wouldn't even foolishly think if they were close by that I could have done anything. Like, it was well beyond that, but it was really sobering for us. And it's really made us ask questions around, what does it mean to do work in a post-conflict situation? What does it mean to do work when an organization, when it begins, has 2 fundamentally different focuses, even though one probably can't survive without the other? Is that the right grant to make if you're early stage and you're far away? And I actually think the answer might be no, at least for us, given what we learned from that experience at the time. So I like to share that because I feel like it's so fun and exciting to think about international stuff, and that one was one of those ones that we were so proud to do the grant, and it was such a struggle. Like, from the day the grant got signed, it felt like it was really challenging. Please.
Was that an international grantee, or was that a U.S. grantee?
That's a really good question. The answer is yes, kind of. So it fit within our guidelines. It was the winner of a World Bank competition that was specifically focused on interesting and important models of education. And it had been referred over us from people at the World Bank's group. And it had a 501c3, and its governing board was in Vermont. And it was but what was tricky was, and this is something we try to do diligence around more now than we used to, it is fair to say that because of the strength of the leadership community in the Sudan community in which the work happened, in hindsight, it's not clear to me that the governance really happened in the U.S. So on paper, it was for sure a 501c3 that was governed out of the U.S., but in spirit, I think less so. And I will say that's the thing I think is much harder to diligence for, and a little morally, ethically, emotionally challenging. So the third grant I was going to describe actually has had this interesting evolution as an organization. So when you ask that question, this is what makes me think of it. I'll start at the end and then go back to the beginning. So there's this organization we funded called Grassroots Soccer. They have a curriculum that they use to bring AIDS and HIV knowledge to kids in Africa. And they serve like 100,000 kids a year. So in Africa is actually a pretty broad geographic catchment. And I can tell you more about the program in a minute, but what's been interesting to watch, so they started as an organization in 2002. We funded them in 2005. They got a huge bump out of the World Cup in 2010. And as you look now at the staff profile of the organization, more and more people who work there are African, which is great. And frankly, really is the trajectory like for lots of organizations to take. And sometimes I'd have to say in my really introspective moments, I ask, what is the point of having a US 501c3? Is it about fundraising? Is it about strategy? Like, what does that mean? Because if you sit in an African nation for a while, my husband and I had a chance in 1998 to travel around the world for 6 months. So we went to 25 countries in 6 months. And we read Germs, Guns, and Steel repeatedly on that journey in an effort to sort of frame this world experience we were having. And so I have this sense of what colonialism at its very worst could mean. And so one of the things that's interesting when you work with organizations that have deep staffs in both the US or expat people in international countries is I'm constantly asking myself what that means. I don't even ask it with like a pro or con, just to like, what does that mean? So grassroots soccer has evolved to be a much more African-centric organization, which is very healthy and exciting. And so it's now begged the question, at some point does the US 501c3 become different than what it is today? Does it become a fundraising arm of the organization and less a governance and strategy arm of the organization? So your question's interesting because I think those things are very hard to diligence for. Like you can read minutes, you can ask who attends meetings, you can ask what kind of conversation happens, but where the heart and spirit of decisions are made is really hard to know. And it's often resonant in a handful of people because they're the people that everybody trusts to make choices. So anyway, the grassroots soccer thing, just to kind of give another arena, and this one, the reason that I wanted to mention this one is because unlike a lot of other social entrepreneurship models that start with one founder, this organization had 4. And actually that's been a really healthy evolution for it. But I've also seen organizations with multiple founders where the whole multiple founder thing is the whole reason why the organization can never go anywhere. So I was thinking if you did entrepreneurship in some form again this year, that this might just be a useful story to unpack. So this organization had 4 different funders. 1 was African, 3 were American. They'd all at different times played soccer together on the college level, on the professional level in Africa. And they each brought very different things to the organization in both experience and credibility. And different kinds of resources too. And so this man, Tommy Clark, and to give a snapshot of Tommy, so Tommy's kind of a person, I mean, he was probably one of the first people I met where I really thought, this is a person who is a global citizen. This person actually probably doesn't really have a place that he considers home, and many places where he goes, people feel like he's of the place where he is at that moment. So Tommy is Scottish, but his father played on the Scottish national soccer team for many years. So as a boy, Tommy traveled a lot around Europe. And so he's Scottish, and he sounds like he's Scottish. But his home is in many places. When his father retired from soccer, he became a professional soccer coach. So as a boy, he lived in Zimbabwe for many years. And his dad coached the Bulawayo Highlanders. And eventually, when his kids became college age, he recognized he should settle in one place for all of his kids to be able to go to college and they could have a family bond. So he was the coach of Dartmouth. Now he's the coach at Notre Dame. And so Tommy went to Dartmouth. All the Clark kids went to Dartmouth, I guess. And so when Tommy graduated from college, he actually went back to Zimbabwe, and he was a member of the team of the Bulawayo Highlanders. And I think it was overwhelming to him. So he's a couple years older than me, and I think it was overwhelming to him. He's about 45, to live in a place where people were sort of serially dying everywhere he looked. I mean, I think the AIDS pandemic had really taken hold by that time, and it was fairly unforgiving in its swath. So that was both his peers on the soccer teams he played on, as well as their relatives and their girlfriends. And so I think he internalized that that was where his mission was something to do with AIDS and HIV work. And it was interesting. I talked to his first board chair. I shared this story with him much later, and she said to me, yeah, Tommy came back, and I could tell he was on this path. He was either going to be a doctor or he was going to be a priest. But you could tell that he had this helping need. He ended up being a doctor. And while he was in his residency in New Mexico, he started a program where he created a curriculum that was entirely soccer-based. And this is before there were a lot of sports and development programs. Sports and development's become a much more common vehicle. And interestingly, I think it's been watered down a lot. So when you look at Tommy's curriculum, the Children's Health Council, it's been written about, has audited his program. It's been written about in the Lancet. Like, his program's actually a medically viable sports and development program. And the bummer with sports and development is it's become a much more fluffy, wide term, and what he does is much more narrow. But he had this program, and he would have people who worked for grassroots soccer who would go out into communities and take kids through this curriculum. And interestingly enough, kids in Zimbabwe that they'd worked with, when they did 3- and 5-year audits of the work, and granted this was self-stated data, most of the kids were 5 and 6 standard deviations away from their peers in terms of the stated choices they made and knowledge they had about AIDS and HIV. And so it was really quite exciting what the power of this curriculum was. And the challenge of the organization over time really was to ask, how can we disseminate this more rapidly but keep its integrity? So Tommy had always been a firm believer, and as a medical person, I really, did you raise your hand?
No, I was just waiting to find. I was waiting for an appointment.
Sorry about that. Tommy, as a medical person, had a very strong sense of what it meant to run a good program. And so the question of like, if everybody works for you, that probably means the program is good. But if you have a train-the-trainer model, does that mean if the program is executed, it's as good? And so a lot of their efforts have really stemmed around how do you speed dissemination while at the same time maintaining quality. If you can do this in 12 lessons, can you do it in 24 lessons that are half as long? Can you do it in 4 lessons that are 6 times as long? Can you do it at a week-long summer camp? And so that's what a lot of his work has been around. But I want to go back to the 4 founders piece because in the end, if you look at the website, there's 4 founders. If you read all sorts of press releases, there's lots of people who are referred to as the founders. But in the end, I think everybody defers to Tommy on the leadership and the strategy. There's one man who's now the captain of the Zimbabwe national football team. He was one of the founders. He went to Dartmouth with Tommy. And I would say he is almost the African heart of the organization. So like if you were to have a big soccer event and someone stood up and said, my life has been touched by AIDS and this is why, it would always be Matembe. Like everybody knows it would be Matembe. Tommy doing that, it wouldn't be authentic in the same way that Matembe doing it would be. One of the founders is now the person who runs the South African office, Kirk. Kirk is American, but he's lived in Africa for so long that I actually think he considers himself to be African. Like I don't think he would ever leave Africa. And that really works. Kirk doesn't like to speak in public places. Kirk really likes to manage things, and he has found a home for himself doing that. And the 4th person, Ethan Zahn, which, as a side note, if you are...
Oh, he's a survivor.
Yes, he was a survivor in the most... Yes. Well, it's so funny. So I'm in this neighborhood babysitting co-op with this bunch of women, and one night I said, oh, yeah, I met Ethan Zahn yesterday. And half the room was like, really? What was he like? He's actually very, very nice and really very handsome. And so anyhow, he was a survivor winner. But Ethan doesn't really like to run things, really did want to come back to the United States. But he raises a couple $100,000 a year for the organization. And my learning about all that was huge clarity in roles, huge deference to the leader, but very much honoring the history. So no one ever sits around and says, who's a more important founder? Or if we could only have one founder, who would it be? Like, why engage in that conversation? But honoring both the history as well as the skills that each person has allowed that to work for them. And I've definitely seen organizations, and when people start to parse out who's going to be on the board or who gets to make that choice, or it becomes so messy. And I was really impressed when they came as a really quite still young organization. I mean, their budget was maybe $300,000. They'd served in aggregate maybe 2,000 or 3,000 kids. It was really small. They were very clear what the story was, because we ask people who were the founders, and then when people respond, if it's more than one person, we'll say, why are you applying for the fellowship? Or if all of you aren't applying for the fellowship, why aren't some of you applying for the fellowship? So it's one of the first things that we tease out with people, and I was always impressed with the clarity that they had around their leadership structure and what it meant to be invested at the beginning. So there's some stories for you to get you some context anyway.
I think you said mentioned fellows. Do you grant fellowship or just to the model?
No, that's a really good question, and I have to say it's one of the areas that we wrestle with a little bit. So we fund in a fellowship model, and interestingly, a lot of our peers do too. Echoing Green has a fellowship. Skoll for a while called their folks fellows, and then they took it off the table, which was probably smart. Ashoka funds in a fellowship model too. But the gift that we give is a general operating support grant for the organization. But it is fair to say that in the diligence process, we focus on 3 things. We focus on leadership, which is nearly entirely resident in the fellow, although is in some respects considering the people around them, the impact of the model and the sustainability of the model. So the person focus is fairly large. And when we do the retreat, we always invite the person who is the fellow. I think what we're trying to do is find a proxy for Bill and Robin's days, which was ask who's actually in charge, who makes decisions, who owns the D, if you will, a lot of the time, which in early organizations, particularly when no one's being paid a lot and people get a lot of psychic energy from being involved in those decisions, it can be very, very hard to ascertain. But it's a good question because we're thinking in our next iteration, we're closing out our first fund. So we've made grants from 2002 to 2010 in one fund. And now we've actually opened up our funding to additional people. We have new people who didn't fund us in the first fund. And we've been talking about not calling the people fellows, but calling them entrepreneurs or something that both acknowledges that organizations are bigger than one person and also gets away from this, what I think ends up being a very confusing lexicon about what it means to be a fellow.